Hi, hey, hello. In recent years, we've been going through something of a cinema lens renaissance, with high-quality, affordable cinema lenses being released seemingly every month. And with so many options available, it can be difficult to make a decision. So I took it upon myself to grab a lens from 4 of the more popular, affordable, and higher quality offerings out there: the Nisi Athenas, the DZO Vespid 2s, the Thypoc Simera-Cs, and the Dulens APO Mini Primes. I'll be testing each lens's performance in both a controlled lens testing environment as well as in a more real-world application. I'm going to go over some of the pros and cons and give my full, unsolicited opinion about how I feel about each lens. Now, full disclosure, 0 of these companies sent me these lenses. I had to beg, buy, and borrow just to make this comparison video. So this is not a comprehensive review on each set of lenses, more a comparison of each lens set's 50mm, or 58mm when it comes to the Dulens. So I have absolutely no affiliation with any of these companies. They more than likely do not know that I exist. So any inherent bias that I may or may not have is strictly down to my personal preference. But I will do my best to be as objective and professional and normal as possible. No pepperonis, I promise. As far as pricing goes, the Athenas are currently the most expensive lenses, coming in at about $1,270 per lens. The DZO Vespid 2s are right behind at about $1,200 per lens. The Dulens APO Mini Primes come in at about $1,000 a lens, and the Thypoc Simera-Cs come in just under that at $959 per lens. Now, the Athenas and Simera-Cs have native mirrorless mount versions available. However, when buying cinema lenses, I strongly urge you to purchase your lens in the most adaptable mount possible. That way you aren't tied to a specific camera ecosystem and can use your lens regardless of camera brand simply by using an adapter. So for the Athenas, the Vespid 2s, and the Dulens, that would be the PL mount version, and the M mount version for the Simera-Cs. All 4 of these lenses are small and compact, especially for Cine Primes, with the Athenas and Vespids being the largest and most similar. The Dulens come in a touch smaller, and the Simeras being significantly smaller than the other lenses. This becomes even more apparent when you take into account the adapters required for each lens. The M-mount adapter is incredibly compact and barely noticeable when mounted onto a mirrorless camera. It actually makes for an even smaller setup than my vintage Canon FD or Helios 44-2 lenses. The Vespid 2s open up to a T1.9, and it is unique in that it has a LiMo port for transferring lens data. The build quality on this lens is fantastic and feels really solid in the hand. It has a 300-degree focus throw that feels smooth and well dampened. The Nisi Athena has that same fantastic build quality, opens up to a T1.9, and has a 300-degree focus throw as well. There's going to be a theme that these 2 lenses are very similar throughout the duration of this video. The Dulens, despite its small size, has fantastic build quality as well. They only open up to a T2.4, which will be disappointing to a lot of users, but with the low light sensitivity performance of most modern cameras, this is not as big of a deal as it once was. It has 260 degrees of focus rotation, and for me was my favorite to operate by hand. However, when adjusting the iris, the combination of it being so close to the adapter mount and the fact that it's noticeably more stiff than every other lens I'm comparing it to makes iris pulls more of a hassle than you may be used to. And lastly, we have the Simera-C, which honestly feels a bit more like a vintage lens in the hand than a proper cinema lens, and I mean that in both a good and bad way. It opens up to a T1.5, which is absolutely incredible given the size and weight of this lens. It's reported to have a 210 focus rotation, which in theory would make for easier handheld operation. However, I found the focus dampening to be just a bit looser than I would prefer, and in my personal experience, it was the most difficult lens to keep my subjects in focus with. The build quality is still really solid, but I would just prefer a bit more tension in both the focus and the iris rings. For these tests, I use my Lumix S5 IIX paired with my Blackmagic Video Assist. Also, all footage is just converted to Rec. 709. I'm not adding any of my usual douchey film emulation. For this lens testing environment, I went with a strong backlight just to see how the lenses would hold up. Wide open, the Vespids remain sharp and maintain its contrast really well, while the hard light source in the back has significant blooming. The Nisi Athena is sharp as well, but is noticeably cooler and less contrasty than the Vespid. The highlight source also shows significantly less blooming, but does have a bit of a lens flare ring surrounding the light. The Simera-C wide open performs beyond my expectations, holding its contrast really well and shows little to no blooming in the highlights. And the Dulens wide open shows significant loss in contrast and has rainbow blooming coming from the highlight source. When stopped down to a T2.8, the Vespid shows less vignetting, but surprisingly blooms even more. Meanwhile, the Athena's contrast bites up and loses that halo around the highlight source. The Simera-C vignettes slightly less, but also shows a bit more blooming with the backlight, similar to the Vespid. And the Dulens gains back just a bit of its contrast, but it's still a bit washed out. Now, just as a point of reference, I did a similar test with the lenses without the harsh backlight and with a model that didn't move around in the seat quite as much. When it comes to focus breathing, both the DZO Vespid and Nisi Athena are very well controlled with minimal breathing, with the Athena being the best performing, with its breathing being nearly imperceptible. The Simeras are definitely the least controlled as they exhibit a ton of focus breathing, which, given the compact nature of the lenses, really shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. And lastly, the Dulens fall right in the middle where they exhibit noticeable breathing. However, it's far less noticeable than the Simeras, but a bit more noticeable than both the Vespid and especially the Athenas. Wide open, the Vespids give you pretty circular bokeh, with some cat's eye and cutting around the edges of frame, while the Athena's bokeh is a bit cleaner with minimal cutting. The Simera's bokeh exhibits a ton of character, where you get swirly bokeh on the edges of frame, as well as onion ringing within the bokeh balls. And the Dulens display minimal cutting and just some lovely cat's eye swirl around the edges of frame. When it comes to close focus, both the Vespid 2s and the Athenas come in at 1.64 feet or 50 centimeters, which is pretty good. However, the Simeras are reported to only come in at 2 centimeters closer. I don't know if it's because of the focus breathing or what, but you can get significantly closer, which once again, these things are impressing me with their performance because they're so small, yet their close focus is definitely better than both the Vespid and the Athenas, and especially the Dulens, as the Dulens comes in at 2.25 feet or 68 centimeters, which is honestly pretty disappointing. Alright, so now I'm going to take the lenses out and put them through various controlled and uncontrolled lighting environments just to try to get a feel for the look and unique characteristics of each lens in a more real-world application. Once again, everything is strictly Rec. 709 here, shot in RAW, just to get the most pure image out of the lenses as I possibly could. Now, this isn't exactly a scientific test because some of the external lighting environments change, like what's going on here, and the framing is a bit different between clips, so I don't know. I did what I could. I'm sorry, I'm not CVP. I'm sorry, I'm not Gerald Undone. I'm sorry, I'm not perfect. Anyway, here's the footage. Alright, so just going over the first setup here, the first thing I'm going to address is the framing is completely different on the Dulens. She was positioned closer to the camera, and I honestly got caught up in how nice I thought the frame looked, so I just kind of rolled with it. Sorry, I'm easily distracted. But for this setup, I was really testing for chromatic aberration in the specular highlights, as well as highlight roll-off in the skin tones. So ignoring the Dulens here, because the sun is noticeably less harsh in that shot, the first thing that stands out is how much warmer the Vespids are than the other two lenses. I would also say that in this instance, they probably did the best job as far as highlight roll-off, but that may just be due to the sun being slightly lower in the sky between lens changes. Also, what stood out to me was with the Simera-Cs, you can notice some chromatic aberration in some of the highlight sources. Now, I personally don't mind it here. I don't find it particularly distracting, but I do know that some people out there absolutely hate CA, so while it is controlled, it is still there. In the second clip for the Vespid, you can notice that there is just a bit of fringing in the window, but overall, the image remains punchy and warm. The Athena renders the frame a bit less contrasty with more of a milky smoothness, which I'm a huge fan of. Also, I'm sorry that I just used the descriptor milky smoothness. The color is more neutral than the Vespids and seems to have a bit less fringing. I personally think that the Athena performed beautifully in this environment. The Simera gives you a bit more of a punchy image while maintaining its neutral colors, but it does have the most noticeable green fringing along the window. Once again, I think that this is fine, but I will point out that its aberration performance is clearly the worst of the four lenses. And finally, the Dulens. The first thing that stands out to me is there is absolutely no fringing in the window. The low contrast design of the lens also gives you a bit more of a lifted shadow look here, and in this instance just really gives off a beautiful painterly image to the frame. For this setup, I was really just testing how the lenses would respond to a pretty contrasty, backlit scene. And outside of the warm color cast, I would say that both the Nisi Athena and the Vespid performed about the same. The Simera was definitely experiencing some veil and glare, which was a bit surprising to me, given how well it held up in my earlier testing, with the light pointed directly towards the barrel of the lens. And the Dulens was noticeably more washed out than the other lenses. Now, I threw a grade on both the Simeras and the Dulens, and while you can bring back a lot of the contrast, getting rid of those glaring artifacts is beyond my personal expertise. And lastly, I wanted to just go over this setup, which was an incredibly difficult lighting condition to test the lens in. The DZO Vespid bloomed out to the point where you could barely make out any details in her face at all, and flared with this very saturated, blotchy rainbow flare, which I personally found to be pretty ugly. I thought the Nisi Athena held up wonderfully once again, and actually had the best looking flare of all the lenses, which also was surprising to me. The Simera once again held its contrast really well, and displayed a thin purple and teal flare that I thought looked pretty good. And lastly, the Dulens was a bit washed out, but actually performed significantly better than I expected. However, I'm not a fan of this yellowish color cast that's affecting the entire image, or the little rainbow flare that popped up. However, at one point, the sun caused the frame to have a red wash over it, which I actually think looks pretty cool. It reminded me of an old school light leak that you might see when shooting 8 or 16mm film. Now, before my final overview of the lenses, there's something that I'd like to address that's mostly aimed towards newer filmmakers. Now, this is probably going to be considered a hot take, but when I'm judging a lens, generally speaking, what I'm focused on are the immutable characteristics of that lens. Things like how fast they are, the close focus performance, the bokeh, the flare, or veil and glare performance. Things that are very difficult or impossible to change in post. I personally feel like certain characteristics like the warmth or sharpness of a lens used to matter a lot more back when people were shooting on film, where the image was essentially baked in, as opposed to now where 95% of us are just shooting digital. And this especially applies to those who are also able to color grade their own footage. So if you don't like how warm the Vespids are, it is very easy to cool them off. If you don't like how clean and quote-unquote clinical the Athenas are, you can always dirty them up. If you think the Simeras are a bit too punchy, they can be dialed back. And if you hate the low contrast look of the Dulens, they can very easily be punched up to be as crunchy as you desire. I say this because when I was first looking into picking up a set of lenses, I would see all this beautiful footage, and oftentimes I was attributing that to the lens as opposed to all the things that make up the image, like the lighting, the locations, the talent of the individual filming the footage, and especially the color grading. It's almost like you get hypnotized into thinking that the lens is what's making these images beautiful. It's very common nowadays to hear people say that the camera doesn't matter and that the lenses do, but honestly, in my personal opinion, I feel like they both matter about as much as each other, which is to say, a bit, but probably not as much as you think. The Vespids give you a solid image across the board with a bit of character with their warmth and blooming highlights. They have a modern, contrasty look and perform well when it comes to chromatic aberration and focus breathing. Just keep in mind that in harsh backlit environments, that blooming could wash out some of the details in your image. The Athenas give you the cleanest and, technically speaking, best performance out of the bunch. They exhibit more of a neutral, modern, but surprisingly lower contrast look. But they do a fantastic job of maintaining that contrast in backlit environments. They exhibit little to no focus breathing, as well as little to no chromatic aberration. They definitely have the least interesting look straight out of camera, but that kind of comes with the territory of being the best performing lens. The Simera-Cs are probably the hardest lenses to quantify here. In most of the reviews I've seen online, they're described as leaning towards a more vintage look, but in some regards, they're actually cleaner and better performing even than the Athenas. I would say that they give a modern, punchy look with a decent amount of character with their swirling cat's eye bokeh, vignetting, and slight chromatic aberration, if you want to call that character instead of a flaw. They're incredibly sharp at their extremely impressive t1.5 aperture, and surprisingly, at least the 50mm has the best minimum focus distance of all these lenses, but also easily exhibits the most amount of focus breathing. They're easily the smallest and lightest lenses, and if you've ever shot on a set of vintage lenses, this feels like the next step up from that. And finally, the Dulens. The Dulens definitely exhibit the most distinct character of all the lenses I've tested. They were designed and advertised as being a set of modern vintage lenses. However, I did a lot of the same tests with my actual vintage Canon FD and Helios 44-2 lenses, and they are definitely better technically performing when compared to actual vintage lenses. They render beautiful painterly images with a low contrast, slightly warm look. They have a distinct swirly bokeh reminiscent of a Helios and having absolutely incredible performance when it comes to chromatic aberrations. The lenses do exhibit noticeable focus breathing, have a subpar close focus performance, and are prone to being washed out in backlit environments. So hopefully that helps you come to a decision on purchasing your next set of cinema lenses. This video took far longer and was far more work than I was anticipating, so if you don't like and subscribe, I'm going to cry myself to sleep at night. Okay, bye.
This is it at 50mm. I don't think you're in focus anymore. It's not parafocal at that point. Those are gunshots.
Farewell, friends.